I froze when I saw that man sit at my wife's table at the company couple's dinner and, without hesitation, kiss her on the lips. I'd arrived late because of an out-of-town client appointment, and when I walked into the room and saw her alone at the table, I assumed she was just waiting. But in a matter of seconds, everything I believed about us, about our marriage, our story, everything we'd built over years of partnership, crumbled before my eyes with the naturalness of a gesture that should have been intimate, but wasn't with me. I froze. My heart sank, my feet glued to the floor, as if time had suspended the air in the room. She smiled at me, that smile I knew so well, the one I used when I wanted to hide it, when I was caught doing something I knew would hurt me, and yet I chose to go along with it anyway. I walked to the table, took a deep breath, tried to maintain my balance, and let out the words I didn't even know were stuck in my throat, cold, definitive, move on with your new love. Forget me. Her eyes widened, she reached for my hand, but I was already turning away. I returned home in silence, packed my bags, and flew to another country the next day. Without a ticket, without an explanation. I left behind a story, but I took with me the wounded dignity of someone who was betrayed within the very thing they valued most, trust. The months that followed were like relearning to breathe. Strange, painful, but possible. The first few days were like silent mourning. Waking up in a new bed, in a city that had no memories of us, was like carrying a hollow body. I avoided thinking about her, but everything reminded me. The way she folded my clothes, the smell of her favorite coffee, the silly jokes she told at night just to see me smile. All of it hurt. Until one day, in the middle of a random afternoon, I met someone. Someone who knew nothing of my pain, but who looked into my eyes and saw something I didn't even know still existed, a desire to start over. And without rushing, without promises, just with sincerity, she helped me remember that there was still beauty in the world. The love that was born there was built on rubble, but there were no lies, no shadows. And that was all I needed. Some time later, for professional reasons, I returned to the city where it all began. It was supposed to be a short stay, a business meeting, and nothing more. But fate, or chance, decided to play with me one last time. It was on a cold Thursday afternoon, as I walked through an old bookstore she loved to visit. My fingers glided along the spines of the books, and then I stopped, surprised, to see her name on my phone screen. I hesitated for several seconds before answering. Her voice was shaky, muffled, as if carrying weeks of tears and regret. She wanted to see me. She wanted to talk. She said she'd never been able to move on, that the man she'd kissed that night was nothing more than an illusion, and that after me, no one had ever loved her like that. She spoke through tears, between sobs and regrets, as if she wanted me to erase everything with a simple, "I understand you." But I didn't. Not anymore. We went to the cafe where we used to have breakfast on Sundays, and seeing her there, sitting across from me, so haggard, so different from the confident woman who once laughed in front of me as she betrayed our history, I realized something inside me had changed. She tried to touch my hand and said she wanted to rebuild, that she dreamed of going back in time, that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. I lost myself that day, she said. But I was no longer there. My body was before her, but my soul was already someone else's. And then she did what I never imagined, she pulled out her phone, opened a photo gallery, and, between sobs, showed me travel pictures. Not hers. Mine. Photos she had discovered by chance, probably through my new partner's public profile. The images showed exactly the places she had always dreamed of visiting. Every landscape, every destination, every sunset she had sketched in old notebooks or mentioned in our life plans. Paris in winter, the lights of Tokyo, the silence of the Swiss mountains, the Tuscan countryside. I went. But not with her. She held her phone as if it were a knife pointed at her own chest. She stared at each image as if it were a distorted mirror of what she believed she could still recover. And in that moment, regret swallowed her whole. "You made all our dreams come true with someone else," she murmured, and for a moment, her voice died. It was more than jealousy. It was the lament of someone who realized that what she rejected not only continued, but flourished, even without her. "I thought you would wait for me," she said. And the pain of those words was the final confirmation of what she never understood. She didn't just betray me. She betrayed herself, her own dreams, the life we could have lived. She let love die on a whim, and when she reached out, she found the void she had carved for herself. I didn't say much. I looked at her like someone looking at an old photograph, beautiful, nostalgic, but without a place in the present. I got up, paid for the coffee, and left. Not angry. Not sad. Just at peace. The peace of someone who no longer carries the weight of betrayal, because they left that burden with the one who caused it. But what she did next, is what no one expected. And that's when the story took a new turn. One no one could have imagined. One that will show how guilt can eat away at someone, how regret can turn to despair, and how sometimes, even when love tries to be reborn, it's already too late. Because what she did after seeing those photos, changed everything. And maybe, just maybe, it was the biggest mistake of her life. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional, created with the sole purpose of showing, with depth and realism, how the betrayal destroys lives, tears up homes and tears hearts apart. These are powerful, moving, and painfully true stories for anyone who has experienced disappointment firsthand. Get ready. What you're about to hear, it will captivate you, it will move you, and it might even give you goosebumps. Now take a deep breath, and get ready for a story shocking. His name was Daniel. A structural engineer, meticulous, patient, a man of intense silences and careful gestures. He had a steady gaze, the kind that conveys tranquility, and a low, confident voice, as if burdened by the burden of always thinking twice before hurting someone. Her name, Laura, was the complete opposite, passionate about words, a literature professor, full of energy, with intensity in her eyes and hands. When she spoke, she gestured as if her soul needed to burst through her skin, and when she smiled, there was something about her that lit up any room. They met at a college event many years ago, and ever since, they seemed like one of those unlikely pairs made possible by the sum of their differences. He listened to her as if memorizing every sentence, and she admired him as if finding refuge in the calm of a safe haven. Their love was born there, unhurriedly, and grew stronger in their daily lives, in the silent mornings with coffee on the porch, in the notes left on the refrigerator door, in the car trips with different playlists for each route. It wasn't an explosive love, it was a love that grew slowly, like roots that deepened before blossoming. They married after 4 years together, in a simple ceremony on a farm where it rained in the early afternoon, but the heavens opened right when they said yes. For them, that marriage wasn't just the formality of a contract, but the confirmation that they had found, in each other, what many spend their lives searching for. The house they chose was on a quiet street, lined with trees and neighbors who smiled at each other. Daniel made a point of renovating each room with his own hands, while Laura chose every book on the shelf, every painting on the wall. They created a home where everything had meaning. There was a vase of lavender in the entryway because she said the scent brought peace. There was a worn leather armchair in the corner of the living room, where he liked to read the Sunday papers. There were memories in every corner. And not just the good ones, the fights over trivial matters, the awkward silences on weary days, the reconciliations made with a hug and no apologies, because they knew each other well enough to know when love spoke louder than pride. Daniel was methodical about his work. He spent long hours in the office he set up in the back of the house, always surrounded by blueprints and models. He was never late for an appointment, never left a task unfinished. He was the type who forgot his own birthday, but never Laura's. He wrote down important dates, knew exactly how many steps it was from the kitchen door to the gate, and enjoyed cooking on Saturdays, even if the rice was always undercooked. Laura, on the other hand, was a restless soul. Sometimes she would start a new book before finishing the last one, rearrange the furniture when she felt time was passing too quickly, and loved inviting friends over for impromptu dinners even without having planned the menu. She had a gift for making everything around her more alive, more vibrant. Daniel was the balance of the house, Laura was the fire. They didn't have children, though they'd talked about it many times. Laura said time was still on their side, and Daniel didn't mind waiting. They believed life should be built slowly, with firm choices. They dreamed of visiting Greece, of spending a month-long sabbatical in some coastal town in Italy, of buying a house with a larger backyard to plant jabuticaba trees. Common, small dreams, but ones that made sense to both of them. And so far, everything had gone according to plan for a happy couple. Or at least a couple trying to be happy. Because there was a routine, yes. There were days when words didn't come so lightly, when their touch seemed more distant, when the time between them was filled with appointments, bills, meetings, and an invisible weariness that lingered in the silences of the night. But even so, there was still tenderness. Daniel made a point of serving her coffee every morning, even on the days she left late and barely managed to say thank you. And Laura would leave the lamp on until he came home late from work, even when sleep overcame her. They loved each other silently, in practice, in routine. It wasn't a perfect love, but it was real. Laura always said that Daniel was the only man she knew who could love without suffocating. And when he spoke of her, he said that Laura was like a burning flame in a world too cold. They had friends in common, intertwined stories with families who already saw themselves as one, trips taken and plans still to be made. When they celebrated 10 years together, he presented her with a handwritten letter, just like old times, and she surprised him with a box containing all the notes, travel invitations, movie tickets, and memories they'd shared together. Nothing seemed out of place. At least not on the surface. Little by little, small changes began to emerge. Things that perhaps no one would notice right away, but which, between two people who know each other even in silence, become screams. Laura started sleeping later, claiming insomnia. Daniel began arriving home more tired, complaining of body aches. Kisses became shorter, glances more rare, and dinners were replaced by separate meals. Did they still love each other? Yes. But the love seemed tired. Not that there were violent arguments or explicit distance, but there was a kind of absence present. As if something were coming and neither of them wanted to name it. There was an unease in the air. Maybe it was the passage of time. Maybe it was the unanswered questions, the postponed dreams, or simply the fact that love sometimes requires more than just the will to stay. Despite this, there was still a bond. A kind of intimacy that only years can build. They knew each other's scent, their gestures, their silences. Daniel knew when Laura needed a cuddle, and she knew when he needed space. They still laughed together when they remembered the hardships of their early trips. They still looked at each other on birthdays as if they shared something no one else would understand. But something had changed. And this change, subtle and almost imperceptible, was the harbinger of a silent earthquake. The days continued to pass. Daniel immersed himself more and more in work, and Laura seemed increasingly distant, involved in projects, courses, new social circles. He noticed, but didn't ask. She noticed, but didn't explain. There was a kind of silent pact between them not to intrude. To pretend everything was still the same. Sometimes Daniel would watch her sleep and wonder when that rift had appeared between them. Sometimes Laura would cry in the shower, without knowing exactly why. There were no fights, no infidelity, no major tragedies. But there was the invisible danger of disconnection. Of the love that doesn't die screaming, but slowly fades. One day, they were invited to a company dinner where Daniel worked. A gala event, with live music, dimmed lights, and smiling colleagues. Laura hesitated, but he insisted. He said it would be nice to relive the feeling of being together in a different place, of dressing up for each other, of feeling proud to walk side by side. And so they did. She wore a long blue dress he loved, and he applied a perfume she always commented on. For a moment, they seemed to have gone back in time. They danced, toasted, laughed. Their hands touched more naturally, their eyes met with more tenderness. And there, that night, they seemed to be reclaiming something that still existed, but was covered in dust. Laura smiled in a way Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. And for a moment, he believed everything would be okay. That they were just going through a rough patch, that they would soon resume their plans, their trips, their smiles at dusk. And maybe they would. Maybe there was still time. But time can be treacherous. And what seemed like a rebirth could actually be the silence before the breakup. What no one there imagined was that that dinner would mark the beginning of something that would change everything. That night, despite the smiles, would be remembered as the point where past and future intersected, never to fit together again. Because what would happen after that, what Laura and Daniel didn't yet know, would leave deep scars. Scars that time cannot erase. Scars that would put that love, which seemed unbreakable, to the test, irreversibly. But until then, they were still just a couple trying to find each other again. And only fate would know what was to come. Laura woke that morning with a strange restlessness in her chest, as if something were about to change, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It was a normal Tuesday, with no major commitments, but the sky seemed grayer than usual, and the silence in the house seemed a little heavier. Daniel had already left for work, as he always did, leaving coffee ready and a quick note on the table, "Good class, love." She smiled as she read it, but felt a hollowness in the gesture. It wasn't the note she was missing, but something deeper, more intimate. Something she might not even know how to name, but which pulsed inside her chest, muffled by weeks of trying to reconnect with a feeling that seemed to fade over time. That afternoon, leaving the school where she taught, Laura walked aimlessly through the downtown streets. She avoided going straight home, as she usually did, and decided to go into a new cafe she'd seen days before. She ordered a hot drink, opened the notebook she always carried, and tried to write. She wanted to understand what she was feeling, to put down on paper the knots that were suffocating her, but the words wouldn't come. Time passed slowly as she watched the people coming and going, the unfamiliar faces, the couples smiling and holding hands, the young people in a hurry, and the old people walking slowly, as if carrying too many stories on their shoulders. She envied them all, each one who seemed to have a defined direction, a clear purpose, a whole heart. When she arrived home, she found Daniel in the backyard, tending to the plants. He looked up and smiled, but she merely nodded, went inside, and headed straight to her room. There was a distance that seemed to exist between them, even in small gestures, and no matter how hard they tried to ignore it, it was there, insistent. In the days that followed, routine continued, but there was something different in Laura's gaze. Daniel, absorbed in work and the need to keep everything in order, didn't notice it right away. And when he did, he preferred to believe it was just another phase, one that comes and goes with time, like all others. Laura began to join new circles. She accepted invitations to cultural events, dinners with coworkers, art exhibitions, and reading groups. She said she needed to renew herself, seek fresh air, and draw nourishment from other sources. Daniel, with his calm nature, supported her. He wasn't jealous, never had been, and he thought it was beautiful to see Laura reconnecting with what made her happy. Little did he know that, behind each outing, there was more than just a search for herself. There were encounters, conversations, glances. And one of them, in particular, began to take up more space than it should. His name was Martin, a new member of Laura's book group. A divorced lawyer, with a gentle way of speaking and a look that seemed to effortlessly decipher what she was trying to hide. He had the charm of maturity, the lightness of someone who knows how to listen, and the sensitivity of someone who has felt too much. Their first encounters were brief, always in a group, but there was something there, a kind of silent attraction that grew, disguised as intellectual affinity. Laura felt heard, valued, seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't that Daniel neglected her, but there was something about Martin that awakened forgotten feelings in her. And deep down, she knew where this could lead. Days turned into weeks, and the line between what was right and what was desired blurred. Laura began to put her phone away, to take longer to respond to messages, to change her perfume before going out. Daniel noticed but didn't comment. Perhaps out of fear of confronting something he already sensed, perhaps out of overconfidence in what they had built. Evening conversations became briefer, dinners less frequent. And, little by little, Laura was no longer there, even when physically present. Her thoughts were elsewhere, in another gaze, in another voice. One Saturday afternoon, while Daniel was traveling for work, Laura and Martin met outside the group setting. It was supposed to be just coffee, but it stretched on for hours. They talked about life, about old pains, about dreams that never came true. And when they said goodbye, the kiss came as an impulse, like a pent-up outburst. It wasn't planned, but neither was it avoided. Laura returned home confused, carrying a weight that seemed too sweet to be guilt. In the days that followed, she tried to act normally, but her mind returned to that moment frequently. The messages with Martin became more frequent, more intimate, more dangerous. Daniel, though silent, began to notice Laura's absences in detail. The scent of a perfume that wasn't hers. The way she smiled at her cell phone. Her disinterest in conversations that were once routine. And, like someone feeling sand slipping through their fingers, he began to understand. He had no proof. He had no certainties. But he felt it. And this feeling corroded inside, like acid. Still, he chose silence. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of hope. He still believed it was possible to reclaim what seemed lost. So he planned a trip. A weekend getaway. Somewhere isolated, just the two of them. He wanted to reconnect, rekindle, understand. Laura accepted the invitation, but something about her seemed out of place. During the drive, she spoke little, staring out the window as if she wished she were somewhere else. Daniel tried to make conversation, remembering old stories, but the sparkle in her eyes seemed to have faded. When they arrived, the cottage was cozy, surrounded by trees and with a blazing fireplace. A perfect place to relive memories, but Laura seemed distant, restless. That night, while he prepared dinner, she stood outside, gazing at the stars with lost eyes. When he returned, he served her with affection, and, without saying so, tried to show that he still loved her. But Laura ate in silence, thanked him with a kiss on the cheek, and went to bed early. The next day, Daniel woke early and went for a walk along the trail surrounding the cabin. He wanted to clear his head, to understand what was happening. When he returned, he found Laura on the couch, fiddling with her phone, her expression heavy. She smiled when she saw him, but there was something false in that gesture. And he knew. Not for any specific reason, but for everything. For every detail that accumulated, for every absence that hurt more than any words. He said nothing. He sat beside her, held her hand, and remained silent. The day passed with a forced lightness, as if they were both performing on a stage of memories. That night, when they returned home, the atmosphere was like a wake. Something had died between them, even if they didn't have the courage to bury it. Weeks later, Daniel was invited to a company dinner. An important event, attended by directors and co-workers. Laura was supposed to accompany him, as she always did, but that night she said she wasn't feeling well. He insisted, concerned, but she declined. She said she needed some time alone, that she was tired. Daniel, though frustrated, complied. He put on his suit, got in his car, and left. But along the way, something nagged at him. An instinct. A feeling that something was off. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, took a deep breath, and, on impulse, turned back. When he arrived at the event hall, he didn't see her. He walked between the tables, chatting with a few colleagues, until his eyes fixed on a table in the back. And then, he froze. She was there. With another man. He didn't know him, but it took a second to understand. They were laughing, their bodies leaning toward each other, and then the kiss happened. Natural, public, intimate. Daniel felt no anger. He felt a kind of pain that doesn't bleed, but consumes. He walked toward them. He stopped in front of the table. She paled when she saw him. She tried to say something, but he was faster. In a low, firm voice, he said, "Move on with your life with him. Forget me." And he left. That night, she packed her things, left the ring on the dresser, and left. No shouting, no drama. Just with her dignity wounded and her heart in pieces. Traveling to another country wasn't a plan, but it became a necessity. She needed distance. She needed air. Laura was paralyzed. She tried calling, writing, begging. But Daniel disappeared. For months, she lived with the weight of the choice she'd made. And it was only then, much later, that something happened. Something not even she expected. Something that would change the course of everything that was yet to come. Something that would make her understand that losing Daniel wasn't just losing a love, it was losing herself. The months had passed with the precision of a broken clock, slow and confused, as if each day carried the same bitter taste as yesterday. Daniel restarted his life on the other side of the ocean, where the streets held no memory, where no face reminded him of Laura, where no corner told him, here was where she smiled. He discovered other flavors, other mornings, other conversations. And, little by little, he found a new kind of peace, one that came not from the absence of pain, but from its acceptance. He met someone different, with a light energy, a calm gaze, and a truth in their soul that didn't try to replace the past, only to build the present. Over time, the wounds stopped bleeding. They didn't disappear, but became silent scars, the kind that teach without needing to hurt. Daniel rebuilt his life with patience. He invested in new projects, cultivated honest friendships, and allowed love to be born again, not in a rush, not out of need, but out of harmony. The woman who now walked beside him didn't make him forget what he had experienced, but helped him remember who he was before everything fell apart. When he had to return to his hometown for professional reasons, it wasn't out of fear. There was no longer any anger, nor any resentment. There was only a cool maturity, a serenity that didn't hide the past, but observed it from afar. And then, as if in a script that seemed carefully written by fate, Laura resurfaced. Not as he remembered her, but as someone trying to hold together the ruins themselves. She appeared out of nowhere, a timid email, a message asking only for a few minutes. At first, Daniel hesitated. But he decided to listen. Not out of hope, nor curiosity. Simply because he knew that certain stories, to truly find closure, needed to be faced head-on. Their reunion took place in a discreet cafe, far from the places they'd frequented together. When she walked in, Daniel realized that time had been cruel to Laura in a different way. It wasn't wrinkles or dark circles, it was something in her eyes. A lost sparkle, a constant restlessness, like someone trying to wake up from a bad dream they themselves created. Laura tried to smile, but it was a sad smile, the kind that apologizes before even speaking. He maintained his composure, listening silently as she broke down. He spoke of regret, of loneliness, of thoughtless choices. He said the man she'd been involved with didn't represent anything she believed in. He said she thought about Daniel every day. That no one else had ever cared for her the way he had. That everything they'd built remained alive within her. And finally, with a broken voice, she asked for a chance. One last chance. Daniel stared at her for long seconds, as if sifting through every memory before deciding if she deserves to live again. But before responding, he pulled out his phone, typed a few quick words, and showed her the screen. It was a photo gallery. Recent images. Him, smiling next to a woman with a gentle look. Them, in a charming cafe. Them, by the lake. And then, travel images. The Eiffel Tower lit up in the background. Sunset in Santorini. The silent streets of Kyoto. The Tuscan landscapes she'd dreamed of seeing. She stared, transfixed. Her trembling hand touched the screen as if it were a broken mirror of a dream that hadn't come true. Tears came before she could speak. And when she tried to take a deep breath, her voice faltered. You took all the trips you promised to take with me. Daniel breathed calmly, rested his arms on the table, and replied in a calm but firm tone. Yes, I did. But not because I wanted to forget you. I did it because I promised myself I wouldn't let your choice kill me. And because I found someone who dreamed of me, not for me. Laura looked away, wiping her eyes hurriedly, as if that might erase the truth. And when she looked back at him, there was a suppressed despair. I dreamed of these places, Daniel. I had a folder with photos, itineraries, dates. I imagined every detail of what it would be like when we were there. He responded without anger, only with a lucidity that cut deeper than any scream. But you chose to dream of someone who didn't want to build anything with you. You left me before you even tried. I left because what was left no longer fit me. She then released the sentence she'd been holding back since the beginning, almost like a final breath. I regretted it that very day. The very moment you turned your back. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and for the first time, he hesitated. Not out of doubt, but out of pain. Because hearing that was like feeling an old cut rip open inside. And then, slowly, he took his phone back and put it away. But Laura wasn't ready to accept the end. She asked for another moment. She said she needed to show him something. She took an envelope from her bag. It was thin, old, and slightly yellowed at the edges. Daniel hesitated, but then opened it. Inside was a letter he'd written years ago. A letter he'd left in the bedroom drawer one day, with promises of love and plans for the future. And along with the letter, there was something else. A plane ticket. Dated weeks ago. The destination, Paris. Laura stared at him, her eyes welling up. I bought this ticket when I knew you'd be back. I thought if I had a chance to win back what I lost, I needed to start with our first dream. Daniel looked at her silently. But he was no longer the same man. And Laura understood this not from what he said, but from what he didn't say. There was a whole world between them. A world she had chosen not to inhabit. And now, it was too late. She tried to smile, but broke down. She cried for real, with her whole body, as if the full weight of her guilt manifested itself there, at the table in a cafe where the walls bore witness to what time had separated. Daniel calmly stood up, lightly touched her shoulder, and simply said, "Take care of yourself." And left. She stood there, alone. With the ticket in her hands, the letter on the table, and the bitter taste of someone who understood, too late, that some mistakes can't be corrected. Because sometimes, love goes away. And when it returns, it's someone else's. Laura remained at that table for over an hour after Daniel's departure, motionless, as if her body were still there but her mind wandering between versions of herself that no longer existed. Her eyes were fixed on the crumpled ticket between her fingers, but it was no longer Paris she wanted to go to. The pain came not only from the loss of the man she once swore to love, but from the devastating realization that she had single-handedly, silently, destroyed everything that gave her meaning. That was the end. There were no more speeches, tears, or notes that could rewrite what had been torn. That night, she returned home like someone returning from a wake, not for someone, but for everything she once believed herself to be. She went inside, turned out the lights, and lay down on the sofa, still fully clothed, her face soaked, her chest heavy with a deafening silence. In the days that followed, Laura began to live as a reflection of herself. She tried to move on, tried to return to her old habits, to her classes, her readings, her coffees with acquaintances, but nothing fit. Every place was now a reminder, every voice an absence, every scent an involuntary punishment. In a desperate attempt to regain some control over her life, she decided to reorganize the house. She wanted to move the furniture around, paint the walls, donate clothes. But deep down, it wasn't the house that needed transforming, it was her. One day, opening an old memory box, she found letters from Daniel that she had never read. He used to write when he couldn't express everything in words. There was one in particular, dated an ordinary day. It said, "If we ever lose each other, I hope we still have enough memory left to know where love stopped being enough." Laura cried so hard she could barely breathe. Life, however, didn't wait for her pain. The bills kept arriving, the days passing, and the world remained indifferent to the tragedy she carried within her. Until, one afternoon, as she walked aimlessly through the city streets, fate decided to shatter any remaining illusions. In a small bookstore, facing the window, she saw Daniel. He was standing next to a woman. They weren't hugging, they weren't caressing each other, but there was a lightness between them that hurt more than a kiss. They were laughing about something, sharing a book, and for a second, Laura felt breathless. This was his new life. And there was no bitterness, no attempt to provoke. There was only truth. She stood there for a moment, unseen, and then walked away with hurried steps, her heart in pieces. That night, unable to sleep, she decided to write. She grabbed the old notebook where she used to jot down ideas for her classes and poured out everything that was bottled up inside, hurt, regret, anger at herself. She wrote to Daniel without intending to send it, just to say what her mouth never had the courage to say. She told him about the days she waited for him to return, even though she knew he wouldn't. She told him about the nights she dreamed of them again, just like before. And she confessed, tearfully, that betrayal was never about loving another man, but about not knowing how to love herself. When she finished, she fell asleep with her head on the paper, as if it were her last attempt to purge the pain. Meanwhile, Daniel was also facing his own battles. Even though he had moved on, his reunion with Laura had shaken him in unexpected ways. Not because of a desire to return, but because he revived feelings he preferred to keep buried. He talked to his new partner about what happened, and she, with the maturity of someone unafraid of ghosts, listened empathetically. She told him that no one is free from being touched by the past, and that she wasn't afraid of its pain, only of the lie. Daniel embraced her gratefully. And that night, he knew he was on the right path. With someone who didn't just want to fix him, but to walk alongside him, respecting every scar. Weeks later, Laura made a decision that seemed simple but required all her remaining courage. She decided to seek him out again. Not to insist, not to ask for anything, but to deliver the letter. She needed to tell him she loved him in a way she only understood after losing him. She needed to ask for forgiveness, not to be accepted, but to be free. He arranged to meet her in an old park, the same one where they used to picnic. He accepted. He arrived punctually, as always. She arrived a few minutes later, visibly nervous. They sat on a bench, and the silence lasted for long seconds before she began to speak. "Daniel, I don't expect any of this. I'm not here to ask you for a second chance. I know you're with someone, and she's wonderful. I saw it. And it was like being punched, but also like realizing the world didn't end. I'm just here to tell you what I never had the courage to do. That I cheated on you wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I no longer knew who I was. I lost myself, and when I realized it, I had already destroyed everything. You gave me love, peace, dignity. And I gave it back with abandon. There's no excuse. But there is truth. I still love you. And I always will. But I don't want to be a burden in your life anymore." She then held out the letter, her hands trembling. Daniel took it, read it silently, and when he finished, he looked at her with eyes full of the past, but without rancor. "Laura, you hurt me more than anything. But I don't hate you. It's just that the love I had for you died that day. And it won't come back. Because now it belongs to someone else. And I'm happy." Laura nodded, unsurprised. Just with a gentle sadness. "It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it was what I needed." She stood, took a deep breath, and before leaving, looked into his eyes one last time. "So, thank you for loving me so beautifully. And forgive me for being so blind." And he walked. without looking back. That same night, Daniel put the letter in a box, along with other memories that no longer hurt as much. Beside it was a plane ticket for his next trip with his new partner. This time, it would be to the icy mountains of Iceland. And for the first time, he felt that everything he'd experienced, even the pain, had been worth it. Because true love, when it arrives, doesn't need to fix anything. It simply blossoms, even among the ruins. Laura left the park without looking back, but each step seemed to require more strength than the last. The world around her remained the same, cars passed, birds still sang among the trees, and children laughed somewhere far away in the garden. But inside her, all was silent, a kind of mourning not for a physical death, but for something much deeper, the awareness that there are no second chances for certain choices. Daniel's goodbye was clean, calm, honest, and that was perhaps the part that hurt the most. There was no shouting, no accusations, no attempts at embarrassment. He simply told the truth with the dignity of someone who had suffered but chosen not to harbor resentment. And this was devastating, because deep down, Laura still wanted to believe there was something she could do to change it, but he had forgiven her, and yet, he didn't come back. When she arrived home, the late afternoon light painted the room golden, but nothing seemed beautiful. She sat on the floor, next to the bookshelf where so many books had been leafed through by hands that had once intertwined lovingly. The silence now tasted bitter, and the clock on the wall, with its constant ticking, seemed to mock every second she wasted trying to fill a void with wrong choices. For hours she sat there, remembering every detail of their conversation, every expression on Daniel's face, every word spoken so clearly. There was maturity in what he said, but also something crueler, the realization that she, however deeply she still felt, was no longer part of his world. Time had run its course, and she had been left behind. In the following days, Laura began to look around with different eyes. The house that had once held dreams was now a museum of memories. The living room chairs, the lamp in the corner, the dishes they'd chosen together, everything told the story of a us that no longer existed. She considered moving, starting over somewhere else, but realized it wasn't the physical space that needed to change, but the way she saw it all. Impulsively, she began donating books, selling furniture, and painting walls. She tried to rebuild herself amidst paint and boxes, like someone who believes that redesigning the house's contours can redesign the souls. But colors don't hide regret. They only transform it into something more bearable. Daniel, on the other hand, had found a new axis. The days had a different rhythm, lighter, freer. The new woman walking with him wasn't a replacement, wasn't a comparison, she was an unexpected encounter that had emerged amidst the chaos. She understood his silence, accepted his moments of introspection, and didn't try to compete for space with memories he still carried. Together, they built something new, with different foundations, without the obligation to erase the past. Daniel had become firmer in his decisions, more aware of his own limits. He had learned that loving doesn't mean nullifying yourself, and that forgiving doesn't mean opening space for the wound to recur. There was a calmness in his gaze now, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has fallen but risen more whole. But the story between Daniel and Laura, despite being over, continued to reverberate within them both. And that's what people rarely understand about intense relationships, they don't end the day they break up. They slowly dissolve, in the details that stand the test of time, in the memories that refuse to fade. On one of those nights when longing insistently lingered, Laura reread the letter she'd written and given to him. Every word was a mirror. And on a page at the end, there was something she hadn't read properly the first time, a passage where she said that, if she could go back, she would have fought for him before betraying him, before losing herself. That thought echoed inside her like an uncomfortable whisper. Why did she wait until she lost everything to understand what truly mattered? It was then that she began giving lectures. About choices, about human relationships, about the emotional impact of thoughtless decisions. She didn't do this as a public apology, but as a cry for transformation. If she couldn't return to the past, perhaps she could help others not destroy the present. Her words, raw and sincere, deeply touched her listeners. She spoke about empathy, about emotional absence, about how important it is to care for those close to us before fatigue and indifference take the place of love. She didn't name names, nor did she mention Daniel, but he was present in every sentence, in every pause, in every suppressed tear. Meanwhile, Daniel dedicated himself to social projects. He created a foundation for young engineers and builders. He wanted not only to impart technical knowledge but also to teach commitment and responsibility for what one builds, not only physically, but emotionally. In an interview, he was asked about his personal motivation for creating the project. He simply replied that he knew what it was like to rebuild after seeing something collapse. And that was enough for everyone to understand that there was much more to it than professionalism. There was soul. Their lives went on. Laura met new people, experienced other realities, but nothing had the emotional weight of Daniel. And she no longer sought that. She simply wanted to be a better version of herself. He, in turn, experienced moments of fulfillment he never imagined possible after what he'd suffered. Not because everything was perfect, but because, alongside his new partner, he learned that mature love requires no proof, only presence. Time passed, and what was once pain became scars. Each, in their own way, found meaning in the chaos they'd experienced. And then, an unexpected invitation arrived for both of them, the inauguration of a community library built with donations from Daniel's foundation, in the same neighborhood where he and Laura had lived. She as a speaker, he as the project's patron. It was inevitable. They would meet again. Both hesitated. But they accepted. Not out of nostalgia, but in recognition of their own journey. When they arrived at the location, surrounded by books and running children, there was a peace in the air that no longer contained old hurts. They exchanged glances, then a faint smile. They talked for a few minutes, lightly, unburdened by memories. And there, among bookshelves and hallways, they sealed once and for all the cycle that had remained open for so long. Daniel, in a moment of pause, watched Laura talking to a group of young people. She gesticulated as always, with passion in her eyes and energy in her hands. For a second, he remembered the woman he'd once fallen in love with. But not with sadness. Only with a kind of silent respect for everything they'd experienced. Laura, noticing his gaze, smiled slightly. And in that moment, something settled in their hearts. Their story was no longer a wound. It was just that, a story. Marked by mistakes, yes, but also by growth. On the way home, Daniel walked hand in hand with his partner. She asked him what it was like to see her again. He answered honestly, it was strange for a moment, but necessary. Understanding that lost love doesn't always have to leave a grudge. Sometimes, it just needs to be remembered as part of the journey. And then moving on. Laura, upon arriving home, wrote one last sentence about Daniel in her notebook. He was the most beautiful love I destroyed, and the greatest lesson I will never forget. Then she closed the notebook and, for the first time, felt she could love again. Not like before. But in a new, more conscious way. Because now she knew the value of what she had once thrown away. But even with peace made and wounds healed, one final truth remained. Something that had been kept hidden for too long, and that would change everything one last time. And it was about to come to light. That night, after the community library's inauguration, as the cold began to subtly descend upon the city and the streetlights lit like candles in a silent ceremony, Laura walked slowly through the already empty streets. She didn't want to hail a car, nor talk to anyone. She needed that silence to digest everything she'd felt upon meeting Daniel again. It was curious how, even after so much time and so many internal ruptures, just seeing him smile sincerely was enough to awaken a whirlwind of old sensations, not as a desire to return, but as an emotional memory the body insists on holding onto even when the mind has already decided to move on. In her mind, the image of Daniel beside his new companion, serene, present, completely different from the confused man who once shared her days, filled her with a mixture of pride and bitterness. Pride in seeing him flourish, bitterness that it was the earth that, instead of nourishing, suffocated his roots. Daniel, for his part, returned home silently. In the car seat, his partner held his hand naturally, without questioning too much, without intruding. She knew there were thoughts occupying his mind and respected the time each person needs to digest old ghosts. When they arrived, he sat in the backyard, lit a small fire in the stone circle, and watched the flames dance in the darkness. He thought about Laura, of course, but with an emotional distance that was new to him. He thought about how, even after everything, there remained a tenuous connection, not of love, but of humanity. It was impossible to share a life with someone and then pretend they never existed. But what he hadn't expected was that their encounter would be merely the prologue to something greater, something that, though belated, still needed to be revealed. 2 days later, Daniel received an envelope at home, with no return address. He opened it with restrained curiosity. Inside was a copy of an old bank contract signed in his name and a short, handwritten note. "I thought you should know. It's only fair." Daniel frowned. He didn't immediately recognize the document, but as he looked at the amounts and the date, something sparked in his memory. It was for an old loan, a considerable amount, taken out in his name shortly before his trip abroad, when he was already emotionally devastated and lost. At the time, he hadn't even known about the loan, as all his finances were automated, and he trusted completely what he had left in his hands. The detail that made him shudder came as he turned the page, the signature. It wasn't his. It was an imitation. A forged signature. The shock was immediate. He took a deep breath, feeling his heart race, and called the bank. After confirming the data and verifying the authenticity of the contract with the legal department, he received confirmation that left him speechless for several minutes. Someone had taken out a loan using his data and forged the signature. In the days that followed, Daniel quietly investigated. He discovered that, at the time, the loan had been transferred to an account not in his name, but which had for some time been joint with his former wife. This was more than a financial scam. It was a prolonged, hidden betrayal, secretly orchestrated while he still believed they were trying to salvage their relationship. The impact wasn't just monetary. It was as if a piece of his story had been written in the shadows. And most cruelly, he had left believing Laura had betrayed him emotionally, but now he understood that the betrayal had also extended to material matters, to legal matters, to matters involving trust in a much deeper way. Daniel put away the papers and sat for hours, unsure of what to do. He could report her. He could confront her. But none of that would bring back what had been taken from him, his time, his peace, his dignity. He preferred to wait. He wanted to understand before acting. It was then that he decided to meet Laura again, but this time not for a melancholic reunion, but to seek answers. He called her and asked to meet somewhere more discreet. She, surprised, accepted. They arranged to meet at an old lookout point, where the city lights seemed to blend with the distant stars. When she arrived, there was a restrained nervousness in her manner. Daniel was calm, but his gaze changed. There was no longer sweetness, only precision. He didn't elaborate. He showed the documents, talked about the bank, the loan, the signature. Laura paled. She tried to deny it at first, but realizing there was no escape, she sat down slowly on the stone parapet, as if the weight of shame were too great to keep her standing. She said she hadn't intended to deceive him, that at the time she was desperate, in debt, and afraid to tell him. She said she thought he wouldn't notice, that she would pay him back little by little. But then came the disagreements, the separation, and she let it go. The words came out in a rush, punctuated by tears that no longer moved him as they once did. Daniel just listened, without interrupting. When she finished, he remained silent for what seemed like an eternity, and then responded with a polite coldness that hurt more than any shout. He said she had crossed a line he never imagined. That it wasn't about money, but about principles. And that, as much as he had already forgiven the betrayal, that was another wound, deeper, more serious. He said he wouldn't report her, not out of mercy, but because he had already lost enough to not want to waste any more time in court. Laura broke down. She begged for forgiveness, tried to justify herself, said she was young, immature, that it was all a reflection of a woman who didn't know who she was. But he just stood up and said, with a firm look in his eyes, "You didn't destroy me when you cheated on me with another man. You destroyed me when you used who I was to play the role of who you pretended to be. And that's what I'll never forget." And he left. That night, Laura understood that the pain of regret never comes from what is done, but from what is undone later. She hadn't just lost a man, she had lost the right to be remembered tenderly. Daniel, on the other hand, found an unexpected liberation in the pain of discovery. It was as if that final revelation had definitively ended a cycle. It was hard, but it was real. And now, he could finally move on without carrying a shadow. He returned home and found his partner reading on the couch. He sat beside her, held her hand, and when she asked if everything was okay, he simply replied, "Now, yes." And in that moment, there were no more doubts. Not about the past. Not about the future. Only about the present, which was finally light. The days that followed that final conversation at the gazebo weren't just the end of a story, but the definitive turning point in each of their lives. There were no grand goodbyes, no speeches of redemption. There was only the silence that follows irrefutable truths, the silence that speaks louder than any forgiveness, that weighs more heavily than any sentence. Laura, faced with the final wound she had caused, understood there was nothing left to repair. This was no longer a broken relationship, it was a bridge that had been burned with all the unspoken words, with all the buried values. And no matter how much she sought in her daily routine ways to redeem herself with her own conscience, nothing seemed to be enough. Time passed. And with it came the consequences. The lectures that once brought her a sense of usefulness began to diminish in frequency. The people who were moved by her stories began to distance themselves when, almost inevitably, the truth about the fraud came to light. Not because Daniel had exposed it, but because the trails we leave always find someone to follow. A local newspaper published an article about financial crimes committed in intimate relationships, and one of the cases mentioned, on condition of anonymity, signature forgery and embezzlement. All it took was a more observant journalist, a coincidence of dates, and the connection was formed. Although her name wasn't splashed across the headlines, those closest to her began to whisper. Invitations were cancelled, partnerships dissolved, and Laura began to live on the fringes of the image she once built. She lost ground. She lost friends. She lost trust. And what consumed her most was the realization that all of this wasn't injustice. It was merely the reflection of someone who, out of impulse, negligence, and selfishness, chose to hurt the one who loved her most. She tried to start over far away. She moved to a smaller neighborhood, rented a small apartment, and returned to teaching more discreetly. But the school hallways no longer held the same admiring looks as before. Parents avoided comment, but students spoke with their eyes. And Laura learned, the hard way, that trust is a bridge that, once broken, is difficult to rebuild with the same pillars. Little by little, her life became a reflection of the loneliness she herself sowed. There were good days, yes, but always clouded by that constant reminder of what she lost, not by fate, but by choice. Daniel, on the other hand, built a new chapter with steady hands. The relationship with his partner blossomed naturally. There was no rush, no need to prove anything to anyone. They cultivated love based on listening, empathy, and mutual respect. They traveled together, laughed at small things, and discussed the future with ease. She never demanded that he forget the past, but helped him put it in its rightful place, on a closed shelf, where we keep what shaped us but doesn't define who we are. When he decided to remarry, he didn't announce it with fanfare. He simply invited a few friends and family to a discreet ceremony in an open field, surrounded by flowers and calm breezes. Laura learned of the wedding through a mutual friend. She stood there for a long time, staring at her phone screen. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply took a deep breath and, for the first time, fully accepted her loss. That what she once had wasn't just about love, it was about character, about presence, about truth. And she failed on all of these pillars. The wedding was serene, yet meaningful. Daniel gave a brief speech, thanking life for second chances and for the people who arrive slowly but truthfully. He spoke of rebuilding, of how the rubble of the past can become the foundation for a solid present. And, at the end of the reception, he sat alone for a few minutes, watching the darkening sky. He didn't think of Laura with resentment. He thought of her as someone who, because she couldn't deal with her own pain, ended up turning others into victims of her emptiness. There was forgiveness in his heart, but no desire for return. It was a final point, filled with gratitude for all he had learned. A few months later, Laura was invited to participate in a podcast about loss and learning. She accepted. And when the interviewer asked what her biggest life lesson had been, she didn't hesitate. She said, with a choked voice, that it was learning that love isn't just about feelings. It's about action, responsibility, and care. She said that betrayal isn't just physical, but happens when you abandon someone you love at crucial moments. She said that regret is a shadow that follows us when we choose the easy way over the right way. And, for the first time in public, she admitted everything. Without embellishment. Without defense. Painfully, but truthfully. The episode went viral. Many criticized her. Others praised her for her courage. But she knew it wasn't about the audience. It was about her. And about the need to, even if late, own up to who she was. Life went on. Daniel became a father years later. When he held his daughter in his arms for the first time, he felt an emotion that seemed to heal deep layers of his history. He told himself he would teach that child about love, loyalty, and respect. That he would prepare her for the world without letting the world harden her. And that, above all, he would show through his own actions that pain can break us, but it can also remake us more human. His new wife, complicit in every detail, saw in Daniel not only the man she loved, but an example of silent overcoming. They built a family based on dialogue, on light laughter, on mornings without exaggerated promises, but with complete presence. A love of peace, after the storm. Years passed. Daniel ran into Laura one last time, by chance, in a small bookstore. She was older, with slightly graying hair, but with a less distressed look. He recognized her first. She hesitated to greet him, but he gave a slight nod and a polite smile. She returned it. No words were spoken. But that gesture sealed the final link in a story that once held love, pain, and a fall, but also learning. And when he walked out the bookstore door, the breeze that touched his face was light, as if the past had finally been left behind. And now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave your comment below. Tell us, have you ever experienced something similar? Do you know someone who has? We want to hear your opinion. And if this story touched you in any way, if it moved you or made you reflect, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and don't miss any of the upcoming stories. And remember, betrayal isn't just the end of a relationship. Betrayal is the end of trust, admiration, and partnership. It's the silent rupture of what was once built with dedication. The choice to betray is never an impulsive mistake. It's a decision that destroys not only the other person, but also yourself. This story is a clear reminder that true love doesn't survive where there's no respect. That the consequences of lies always come. And that, as much as time heals, it doesn't erase the traces of what was done. This channel does not and will never support any kind of betrayal. Here, we tell stories so you understand that the truth can hurt, but lies always destroy. Until next time.